Hi, welcome to Kopi Time, a podcast series on markets and economies from DBS Group Research. I'm Taimur Beg, Chief Economist, welcoming you to our 125th episode. We are recording this during the third week of May, just a few days before I head to my first post-pandemic trip to China. I'll write about my impressions when I come back, but first, I want to devote this episode to discussing China with Mitchell Presnick. Mitch's engagement with China goes back to the late 1980s and continues through today. He's currently a visiting fellow of practice at the Fairbank Center for Chinese Studies at Harvard University, where he's researching the future of US-China commercial relations in the post-engagement era. Let's connect to Boston. Mitch Presnick, welcome to Kopi Time.
Hi, Dimer. Nice to see you and nice to be with you today.
It's great to have you, Mitch. Mitch, I'm going to go straight to some impressions that you can share with us from the hallowed academic halls at the Ivy League. We hear a lot about China-related antagonism in Washington, D.C. But when I travel to the U.S., Mitch, I see pockets of desire to engage in Wall Street, where some portfolio managers see value in bidding down Chinese financial assets. I see pockets of interest in the Midwest, where the farmers find it very lucrative to sell their products to China. And in Silicon Valley, where the likes of Tesla and Apple do the same. What's the mood in a place like Boston?
Well, first of all, the West wants to win, right? That's the goal. The West wants to win. So that's what's happening in all of those places you mentioned as well. They want to win. If you're in the Midwest, you want to continue to export your products to markets that you can be paid well for it. That's China. If you're on Wall Street, you're trying to decouple and you're trying to de-risk where you must, but otherwise you want to win, and that means you have to play in international markets, and that means you need to be playing with China. So even in Washington, D.C., even the defense industry understands that its supply chains are intertwined with China on rare earths and on a lot of their advanced equipment. So there's nowhere really in the country that has one mind. Generally, there's a feeling here at Harvard that all of this needs to be looked at holistically, which is why I'm here, because I find that the conversation here is the conversation we need to be having anywhere in the West that we're dealing with China, which is how does the West deal with this new era that we're in? And the era we're in is the U.S. is no longer the sole hegemon. China is no longer in the Deng Xiaoping reform era, and the U.S.-China relationship is no longer in the engagement era. So where do we go from here? And everybody's taking a little look at that from their own point of view. There's no one consensus, but I can tell you that some of the most interesting conversations I'm hearing anywhere are taking place here at Harvard, because we're a little bit away from the DC conversation, and we're a little bit away from the New York conversation, and yet the professors and researchers that work here are very much involved in those conversations. And even what I'm doing, for example, I'm looking at the long-term deep implications of these changes on the US-China relationship in the business sphere. Because I believe that the US-China Business Council and the US Chamber and the American Chamber of Commerce in China, they're already doing all the great work on what do these tariffs mean for us and what do the new tariffs that Trump is proposing mean for us. But what I'm looking at is, what are the long-term implications? How do we move out of a mindset which isn't going to serve us into a mindset which is going to serve us, right? And that's what I think is the interesting conversation to be had right now. Because we're a little away from it here, we perhaps have the advantage of a little bit more objectivity. Perhaps we're not in the daily conversation as much.
Mitch, I want to stay with Boston and the academic world for a little longer. While you are somewhat insulated from the day-to-day noise in Washington, D.C. and perhaps elsewhere, I do read stories about academic interaction between Chinese and U.S. universities becoming less frequent, Chinese scholars getting denied visas for certain things, Chinese students in sensitive quote-unquote programs not being allowed admission. So you're not that insulated, are you?
No, that's a great point, Tamer. So obviously it's a complicated picture, right? I mean, everything is a complicated picture. Talking about U.S.-China student exchange, I was part of that original wave that went over in the 1980s, and we can talk about that. But the school of thought that I belong to is that understanding China better is a good idea regardless. It just creates understanding in many ways. Even if one wants to approach it in a zero-sum world, they still want to understand China much better than one can just reading and writing research papers on this side of the pond, right? So, let's just set the table for that. My advisor at the Fairbank Center is a very famous professor named Dr. Bill Kirby. And Dr. Kirby, he's been championing U.S.-China academic exchanges for decades. So, obviously, we have our views. But generally speaking, considering the fact that the relationship has veered into a very antagonistic, acrimonious relationship, there's still 200 and whatever it is, 70,000 Chinese students studying in U.S. schools. I wish I could say the same about our, students in China, but nonetheless, these problems are being worked out. The U.S. is finding its way, and look, for the like I said, we're no longer in the engagement era, so it's all bets are off now, right? So anything has to be reviewed with fresh eyes. When President Xi was in San Francisco and proposed the idea of bringing over 50,000 American students, there were actually American groups that came out and said, "Oh, this is a communist ploy," And I thought to myself, if there's one thing that's not a communist ploy, it's us understanding them better so that we can be in a better position to work with them. I don't see how that is possibly just because China wants something doesn't automatically mean that it's not something that we don't benefit from as well. And that's what I think is lacking in some of the conversations, which lead to the idea of decoupling or zero-sum mindsets, which frankly I believe have in part helped us get here, and they're not going to help us get where we need to go. I can
Mitch,
go on about.
no, but I want to talk about that little thing that you touched upon, that you were among the first waves of US students who went to China in the late 1980s, which was a very pivotal moment in China's history. So please indulge us a little bit. Talk about your journey, travel with us back to the late 80s, and what did you do there? What took you to China then?
So my uncle came back from China. He went to visit China in 1983. He met the great Sidney Rittenberg, who was a contemporary of Mao and the Chinese leadership in Yan'an, well before the Communist Party took over the country. And Uncle Mike and Sidney became good friends, and Uncle Mike came back, and he was completely inspired by China's economic future, and decided that it was very important to him that his nephew go to China, right? And he said, "If I was your age, I'd go to China. You need to go to China." I thought he was, a little bit optimistic about my ability to adapt to a foreign country. Plus, I didn't even really understand that Mandarin was different from Cantonese. So I was watching Bruce Lee movies, assuming that was the language he was telling me I had to go learn, and there was no way I was going to learn Cantonese. So, but I did understand something, which was that every Chinese person I knew in the U.S., they were hardworking. Like they were out there. You could see them out there. They were hustling. They weren't, in Brooklyn where I grew up, they were running around. They weren't sitting around relaxing. And I thought to myself, if the economic policies that China has instituted are going to allow people to unlock this natural work ethic and this natural entrepreneurial zeal, then the country would really rise. That was my thesis, and I stick by my thesis. Right, I'm very much a long-term believer in China's potential. I just know it's factually accurate that these guys are perennial champions at the global World Cup of business. They've been there for a long time for good reasons. They're very good at organizing at scale. They have certain values which work very well with productivity and comity and economic growth when they got everybody focused and when there's no chaos. So So I went over for that reason, and I wrote an essay to that effect to Peking University. I was the first American ever to write an essay saying, "Hey, I want to come here and I want to learn their language to do business with China." And they thought that was interesting enough for them to make an exception on their normal high standards. I'm sure because I didn't really speak Chinese, so so I went over, and the China I arrived in, we flew over Beijing on our descent, and there were no lights on in the city. I mean, you have to remember this was 1988. China was just a little over 10 years out of the Cultural Revolution. Most people were either wearing, what they call Mao suits, the sort of the tunics, the blue tunic, and some of the ladies were wearing white blouses with long slacks. But that was the uniform. Everybody rode bicycles. We had bicycle traffic jams. But there was a feeling in the air which was just amazing. Like there was this feeling, like they had this whole feeling of optimism, and the country is coming back, and everybody could get behind, the Deng Xiaoping to get rich is glorious, and black cats and white cats, and just the flexibility that was being introduced into the system after such a long period where centralized authority had stifled every bit of creativity and individual hopes and everything, and it became a very, very dystopian environment, according to Sydney and others that I talked to. So I saw that transition. And once you see that transition, well, it's amazing, right? It just encourages you to learn and to want to be part of it. And so I did. I dove headfirst into Chinese culture, Chinese language, Chinese philosophies. I find it interesting that China has several influential global philosophies, including their version of Buddhism and Taoism and Confucianism, amongst others, not to mention Sun Tzu and Mencius. And there's a lot there. There's a lot of collective wisdom there. And so for me, it was originally a plan to go there and to get rich. I was going to bring an American brand. I was going to develop it in China, let my Chinese partners make all the money first, and then that would then deliver the equity value that would eventually allow me to make money. But by the time I was in my fourth or fifth year, I realized that was the reason that got me to China. But the reason that I was happy to be in China was I was able to develop more individually as an American going over, having a patriotic capitalist mindset coming in, retaining that, but then now adding some interesting new software modules and trying to become something that I'm still trying to do today, which is to serve as an objective, practical, rational bridge between the two sides, find where there are opportunities, even though those can be hard to find.
Okay, so you built a business there. Tell us a bit about the business building phase and how successful and how large it became eventually.
So I believe that China was going to need brands, right? When I arrived, China had no brands. China had Qingdao, they had Air China. There were almost no brands that had any resonance outside of China. And they didn't really understand the concepts of brands, that they were like a living thing that one nurtures and has to, develop, and has its own personality and has its life cycle and all of that, and represents certain ideas. These were all ideas that I knew the U.S. was very far advanced in, but China was not. So I could come from the future. So that was always my business plan, right? So I worked with other brands. I was part of the team that brought Budweiser to China in 1995. Budweiser, by the time I left, they had about a 1.5% share by volume, but they owned about 10% of the national profit pool. So I watched how an American company could do it right. When they did it right, it was very successful. And then I ran Edelman, which is one of the large global communications firms in China. So I worked with, brands like Procter & Gamble brands and M&M Mars brands and Johnson & Johnson brands and so forth. And what I learned then allowed me to develop my own brand, which was the Super 8 hotel chain in China, which I established in 2004. acquired the rights from the U.S. brand owner, which is Wyndham Hotel Group, and then we developed them all over the country. We started with 3 the first year, and then we had like 35 or 36 by year 3. But by the end of year 4, we were building a new hotel and opening it every 2 to 3 days. Yeah, and by the time we got to 2010, we were opening a new hotel every 1.5 days. So it was a very, very successful model where we had to bring franchising as a concept and economy hotel chains as a concept, at least the American version of it. And we invented the concept originally. So we brought those 2 ideas, and we then completely localized how we executed on that plan. And we worked with local partners, just basically dusting off my old business plan from undergrad, and looking at it and saying, how do we let these guys make a lot of money on this thing so they'll word of mouth tell everyone else, and then eventually, the brand will succeed. And it was a high wire act, man. I mean, we were a startup with very little capital trying to build a national business in China. It wasn't advisable, but I didn't really have a choice. I didn't really have a better option. There were no well-heeled angels willing to write me enormous checks. I got a check for $500,000 from an angel, and then on the back of that, we raised a couple million over a couple of years. We finally had a pretty strong raise in 2007. We raised $50 million on a pre-money valuation of $50 million from a U.S. private equity fund. And then at that point, I stepped away from management, which had been my goal all along, to institute Chinese local management into the business. And then I stepped back to chair, and and then I moved to Hong Kong, and where I still hold permanent residence.
How well is the brand doing today?
It's doing really well. It's like 1,200 hotels. It's steady. I won't say it's a growing brand at this point, but it's a very solid brand. We focused on, look, if you're a foreign brand in China, there aren't a lot of advantages, despite what people think. The actual advantages are with the home court. And because government and industry and and customers are all sort of working together with home court advantage there, and the local rules on how things are done, and the understanding that they call it bentuhua, localized approach. So we could never be localized. We knew we were a foreign brand. We tried to be as local as we could, but where we had advantages, where we could standardize maintenance schedules, we could standardize ideas on how to ensure that every customer was a quality assurance agent, so that we incentivized them to look around the hotels for any problems. And we, as a result, created the highest customer ratings in the business. Now, were we able to grow as fast as our competitors? No, but we're still there. We're still in the game. And that's the point. When you're a foreign brand in China, there's 2 things that matter. Number one is, if you compete in that gladiators arena, then you're just more effective when you're competing outside, right? Because that's about as tough an arena as you'll ever face, because you're facing home court advantage. It's not a level playing field on the execution side. There's a lot of reasons why a foreign business needs to be extra vigilant and extra good at what they do. But 75 U.S. companies in China make $2 billion or more in revenue, and like 20 EU companies, the top 20, all generate more than 4 billion euros in China. So, I mean, the reality is, what I learned about doing business in China, it does travel well, right? Because there's no multinational company that's ever going to exist in the US or Europe, or anywhere that that can rest assured it's going to enjoy global dominance if they're not in China, right? There's just nobody that can do that. And you can see it in example after example. I mean, look at the US EV industry. The only player that's really showing any signs of fight is Tesla. And Tesla went into China, and they had to deal with that. And they had 4 price reductions in 1 year because of the cutthroat market that they were competing in, and because they were competing against some extraordinary, local brands like BYD and NIO and Xpeng and now Xiaomi. So so all of this was sort of the experience I had trying to help American companies be successful in China is what I'm trying to do now, right? I'd like to see that knowledge flow to other American CEOs so that they can get into a mindset which will actually help their business.
I mean, that's such a great piece of insight, Mitch. And I got a whiff of this insight a few months ago when I was talking to Charlie Ormiston, who used to head Bain Asia. And one of the things Charlie said, and I think you would sort of, find resonance in that, was that people underappreciate the fierce level of intra-provincial and interprovincial competition that exists in China. And when we only look at, the reasonable price structure of Chinese companies from the lens of subsidies, we miss out on the fact that, there's fierce creative destruction happening, and the survivors are the best in the world in efficient production.
That's exactly right. Yeah. Very interesting.
Yeah. So, Mitch, I want to sort of, press you a little more on these sort of rich insights that you have, because, we talk a lot about China in the context of macroeconomic numbers, per capita growth, and overall GDP size, and that sort of stuff. That's easy. I want you to give me a little more of a qualitative assessment of the profound transformations that you have seen in China over the last 3 decades.
So, first of all, let's just kind of set the table. China has gone from a predominantly rural country to a predominantly urban country in the years that I've been there. And it went from a centralized command structure to a decentralized command structure, which is now re-centralizing, or at least it's finding a balance point. So just structurally, right, those are massive changes for a country to undergo. It went from a kind of communism which was not serving the interests of their economic growth goals to one that is. And so that's what's happening. What's really important, though, is the people level changes, right? So, like when I first arrived in China, they were completely curious about the outside world, but they didn't know much about it, right? They really didn't. It was it was a different time. First of all, it was a different time technologically, right? So now because of technology and hyperconnectivity, whether you're talking about China or US or Singapore or anywhere, everybody is hyperconnected. So kids are far more switched on. When I arrived in China, we didn't have email or text or whatever. So that's the biggest change, right? It's not even really a China-related change. It's China is a looking glass through which you can see those changes, but the changes that have occurred have been changes related to hyperconnectivity and the Fourth Industrial Revolution. The way people interact. Every single kid now has their own global broadcast station. I was watching this American woman. She gets on TikTok and she says she's looking for a man, in finance. Trust fund, 6'5", blue eyes, and this becomes
I've seen it.
this becomes this global sensation in all the EDM and rave festivals. And one person can get out now, like into everyone. That didn't exist before. It still does exist in some degree in China. China is such a big market, so that they've got their Douyin and they've got their versions of social media that we use. And they also have they also have ways of accessing things outside with getting outside the firewalls with VPNs too. So it's not as if we're not talking North Korea here, all right? It may be a different environment, but it's not exactly. So those are the big changes. People level changes are there, and they're so switched on now in China. They're so with it. there was a time where I really felt like, oh, if you're coming from America or West, you're coming there, you're just more switched on. They may have advantages. They may be more mindful. They may be more calm. They may have a mindset of collectivism, which can be very helpful. And I believe more aligned with nature. Nature is a collectivist based system where the needs of the group outweigh the needs of the individual. I thought there were some real advantages that they held. Now they have those advantages, plus they have the advantages of hyperconnectivity and tech and the mindset, which is just as developed and just as switched on, in some ways more switched on than even we are in the West. And I don't know when it happened, but their rate of increase in understanding and awareness was the most incredible part of China's transformation from my point of view.
Mitch, I want to touch on that one point you made, which is that through this 3 decades, it's gone from heavily centralized to decentralized, and now some degree of re-centralization. I would like to think that this re-centralization, no matter how top-down it is, cannot take the Chinese genie back in the early 80s bottle. Like speech, for example, you were talking about the Chinese communicating through social media. Surely speech cannot be as restricted today as it was 30 years ago.
Well, it's not. It's not as restricted. Look, the difference is technology is a double-edged sword, right? So now the government, of course, what happens with technology in any country is first the government tries to suppress it, and then it tries to colonize it. And so that's kind of what happens when, Bitcoin, first it was dismissed because it's a threat to fiat currencies, and then it becomes something that countries start developing their own digital currencies as a bulwark or whatever. But there's always going to be that kind of response. First dismissal, then colonization. That's happened with China too. So China actually, both the benefits and the negatives of technology are both being applied. Not in the way necessarily that we're hearing in the West. This whole social credit score, I've never been able to find any data to support, nor any Chinese person that I've ever spoken to about it, and I've spoken to a lot that have any idea what I'm talking about. Not to mention the fact that we have a credit score here. It's called a credit score. And it's very important if you want to rent an apartment or you want to get a loan. So it's not like we don't have it. What's kind of scary is that the idea of applying technology in ways that could be used in a centralized model, people say, well, what's the check and balance there? Well, the check and balance is that the government has to contribute to the lives of the people, or it actually does find itself in a bad place. And I will say, I'm not an advocate for China. I mean, as I said, I'm an American, but I will say that when you look at the actual track record, even of the current administration, what you see is zero COVID until the people had enough.
Absolutely.
Then maybe you can argue about the method. The method wasn't elegant and it caused a lot of damage. Yes, I think there would have been a lot of deaths either way, but it was a lot of damage in the way it was handled. But it was done that way. When it really came down to it, I was in Beijing in June of 1989, so I've seen the government handle things a different way. And in this case, there was a very practical, I would say, very mercenary but practical approach, which is when it really got bad, we're going to just forget this. And that's been the case with several issues. I mean, even the latest very dovish policies toward the Chinese stock markets, right? They also indicate that this administration may not feel that great about financial markets and the capitalist side of their growth model. I mean, they're everything, right? They're laissez-faire, they're state capitalism, they're Keynesian when they want to be. They'll just do anything, right? But the fact is, when it came down to it, even this administration said, "Fine, let's go all in on dovish policies, which will help support the stock market because we understand that's important for our goals." That's how I think things like administration of technology with regard to the population is going to be prosecuted, usually with a practical and we're seeing the indications that even with the pendulum swinging back, there is some reason for hope.
Right. There is some reason for hope, but at the same time, from where you're looking at the world in the East Coast of the United States, the antagonism is rising. So, Mitch, let me ask you this. When did you first notice a shift from China-US broad level engagement to China-US rather out-and-out antagonism?
I've always been focused on the business side of this relationship, and I still am. I'm here researching U.S.-China business relations in the new era. So I'll talk about it from the business point of view. In 2008, when the U.S. had its housing crisis, which then led into the global financial crisis, that was the first time I noticed that Chinese were starting to say, maybe there's not as much behind what these guys are saying as we thought. Because before that, there was really, and I saw it in all the meetings. I was vice chair of AmCham and on the board for many years. I was involved in, discussions on both sides. I, started and ran a public affairs firm, so I was always dealing with government on both sides. And I noticed that was when the Chinese government started to say, okay, these guys are human. They're not gods. They somehow had this idea that they really worshipped, I think, what the U.S. had accomplished economically, and we received an enormous amount of goodwill and credit for that. And then they started to wonder if either we had lost our touch, or if perhaps we just kind of got lucky harnessing the great forces of capitalism. But whatever it was, I noticed a switch. And then during the Beijing Olympics, you could really feel that they were starting to, a coming out party at the opening ceremonies, and Super 8 managed part of the Olympic accommodation village, and so we were involved with the Olympics at a pretty deep level. And I was impressed, but not only how their execution was so flawless, but also just how proud they were. And I was like, oh, this is like a different China. This is the China that you always heard about when you read the old history books. This is kind of like that China, like a little bit more like dun 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 dun. Here we are. And that's when I really noticed it, Timer. And then around 2012, the volume started to turn up quite a bit, where American CEOs were now openly complaining to their friends in Washington, with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, with U.S. China Business Council, even AmCham, about that. Hey, we've been waiting a long time for China to execute on its promises, that it's going to, honor our agreements more and protect our IP and all these things that we've been asking for. And we really need help now. So they started to actively seek government support. And that's when I noticed the shift. Really, the shift happened. Trump read the room, but he didn't create it. This idea that he created is, I don't think people in the business community who are in the know would necessarily agree with that assessment. But he was right in that he read the room, that the U.S. was ripe for a reassessment of this relationship, that there was a lot of disillusionment. There was a feeling that the U.S. was not being treated as a equal, fair partner, that there wasn't the same kind of approach that the U.S. was taking as China was taking. And to a large degree, I say that's actually true. The Chinese felt that they were catching up, and that they were going to leverage the United States and the West and benefit in ways that would be long-term important for them. And, and to kind of make up for the mistakes of the late Qing, where the late Qing famously, rejected British manufacturing during the Industrial Revolution. And they made the connection that, okay, that arrogance and that unwillingness to learn caused us a lot of problems. The century of humiliation was at least partially because of their own weakness. And there were other reasons too, but that was certainly, I'd say, either the major or a major reason for that. And now they were going to make sure they didn't make that mistake again. They were going to be humble. They were going to learn, and they did. And they did like they always do. They overachieved, and they learned so well that they just crushed it. And now, and now we find ourselves in this time we're in, this 2024 time. But it's got to be said that this is taking place during the backdrop of AI and the fourth industrial revolution. This isn't being prosecuted during the time of the 1960s where you could actually cut countries off, right? So the idea that we could sort of go back to a zero-sum Cold War mindset, it may be comforting to people in government on both sides, but it's not realistic. It's not realistic when you really look at the world we're in now, and it's not realistic for business. Forget about anything else. If you look at like sort of people, corporations, and governments as separate entities that exist on this earth, yes, I know one is populating the other and so forth, but the reality is if you look at them as separate, well, corporations are extraterritorial, and they operate with autocracy and meritocracy, and they serve a certain set of stakeholders, and they have to be efficient. So the antagonism that we're in now, I believe the approach has to be sort of, did you ever read Nassim Nicholas Taleb's book, Antifragile?
Yes.
The theme is, of course, that things which benefit from disorder, right? Different from creating robust systems, which is what the Cold War was. Let's build an iron curtain and let's protect ourselves behind it. And of course, we saw how that worked out for the USSR. The US is now sort of building its own sort of walls and curtains, and in technology, small yard, high fence. It's actually a huge yard and a high fence, but unfortunately it's boxing us into it. That's what bothers me. Like, I mean, I don't want to see us think we're building a castle, but we're actually building a prison for ourselves, because China is the largest trading partner for 140 countries around the world now, right? China has more skyscrapers than the rest of the world combined, intelligent manufacturing equipment than the rest of the world behind. As far as things that they have that is like a larger sum than the rest of the world combined, there's like 50 things now, including high-speed rail, including patents, including there's a lot. There's a lot going on there. Shipbuilding capacity, the 200 times the shipbuilding capacity. So whatever we think about the world that got us here we are. And I'm arguing that forget about how we got here. That's a nice conversation that you can talk about over coffee. But what are you going to do now? That's what's really important. And yes, we are in an antagonistic relationship, but we must build an anti-fragile system, a system that actually benefits from the business community point of view, that is, from this. And it has to be said, the business community is the greatest contributor to global stability in the world, because it is the bastion of win-win and shared interests. And even now, the pendulum may be 80% conflict, 20% cooperation between the US and China, and seems that the EU is moving that way too. But it's always been on a pendulum. And even during the headiest times, which, China's ascension into the WTO, or the GATT, then became WTO, it was still 20 or 30% competition, and the majority was cooperation. So we're on that continuum, and the continuum remains. And it may be a non-voluntary symbiotic relationship, but nonetheless, it is absolutely a symbiotic relationship.
Mitch, I want to expand on the issue of businesses. I mean, I know that you spend a lot of your time thinking about this issue, and that's your core work at Harvard right now. Are American businesses adjusting their playbook, or are they sort of giving up on China with the myriad of de-risking and decoupling and that sort of rhetoric all over the place?
So corporations have to operate within the environments that they're in. And those environments are dictated by governments. So, of course, what's happening with the bilateral relationship between the US and China, and what's happening between China's relations with the developed West and other countries, that's very important to them. But what's also important to them is they've got to compete globally. And so decoupling and de-risking are not necessarily things that business sees as synonymous, right, as they are seen that often in government, when government talks about it. Business doesn't have that luxury. Business has to look at things in terms of supply chains and how do they diversify to supply chains, but still acknowledge the reality that there are supply chains that China dominates and will likely dominate for the next 10 years. Even if we were to create a whole country effort, those things are still probably likely to happen. So things like that are going on. What's really happening right now is companies are trying to decide how much investment to make in China now. And right now, for the time, a lot of companies have put a pause, but not all companies have put a pause. Like VW recently announced a 2.5 billion euro investment into EV in China because they understand that they've missed a step there and they're losing market share. They were at one point the largest foreign auto brand in China. Now they're just like in a free fall. So they're fixing that. So there's going to be a lot of cases where European and American businesses are going to have to figure out how to navigate this world that we're in. I think it's interesting that, 40 years ago, China created policies which allowed technology transfer. They basically set up high import barriers like tariffs and other non-tariff barriers, but then encouraged companies to invest in China. You saw Macron recently came out and said that they welcome BYD and the Chinese EV makers to be in France as part of the French auto industry. So that's something that we're going to be seeing more of. In the U.S., there's a company called Illuminate USA, which is a JV between China's largest solar manufacturer, LONGi, and one of the leading players in the U.S., a company called Invenergy. And they built a huge plant in Ohio, which just opened a few months ago. And they're manufacturing China's most advanced solar photovoltaic cells for sale in the U.S. market. So that's a case where, tariffs can be applied, but if it's to encourage the resurgence of a U.S. industry in that sector, that's something that I think companies are going to start moving towards. Companies are Darwinian wonders, right? They always adapt, and they are very much evolutionary. And what we know about anti-fragility is that anti-fragility is all about evolution, right? Evolution is anti-fragile. It benefits from the chaos. It benefits from the survival of the fittest mentality. Tariffs are the opposite of that generally, but if for a time they can be applied to help transfer technology and know-how that the U.S. and Europe has somehow lost, well, that's okay, because China dominates intelligent manufacturing now. China dominates digital infrastructure now. China dominates in green technology now and other areas. And these are all, what they have in common is they are all part of the fourth industrial revolution, the next wave of industry and how industry is going to develop. So these are all things that companies are looking at now, and it's much, much deeper and more complex than just, are we in China or not in China? Do we sell our products? Even if you do nothing but just sell your products in China, you're also competing in China, and we know what happens when you don't compete in China. Then it's very easy to get blindsided. So that's what they're dealing with, and that's what I'm advising, on the boards that I sit. That's what I'm advising my friends and clients to do.
Now, Mitch, I know that you don't spend too much time thinking about policy, but I have to ask you one policy question, because when I was in Washington, D.C. in April, all I heard was overcapacity, overcapacity, overcapacity. And I have a feeling we're going to hear it over and over again for the rest of this year, if not longer. What's your view on this overcapacity issue that the U.S. Treasury is raising? Because you just talked about a bunch of areas where China now has market leadership, not just in terms of production, but also in terms of IP. So when we talk about overcapacity, are we just saying that they make a lot of stuff?
So in most industries in China, if you're talking about an industry which has a capacity matchup against just domestic demand, then almost any industry in China is an overcapacity industry. Shipbuilding, robotics, EV, you name it. Their model has always been a manufacturing export-led model. It was never at least until recently, a consumer spending growth model. It was never supposed to be, and now they've tried to change that, and they've had a hard time getting over the 50 mark. Whereas the U.S. I think contribution of consumer spending is like something like 75%. So I mean that's very healthy. The U.S. has an advantage on this one. China is anemic in that regard. Part of that is because they have not created enough consumer confidence to allow people to spend more. But the reason for that is because they've never created a proper social safety net or land reform or property tax. Right now, the Chinese consumer is not really able to absorb the capacity of China. But here's the little reality that we're not considering. That was never the plan. China has always looked to Germany and Japan for guidance on its manufacturing capacity. And those two countries have managed to stay in the leaderboards because of export-led manufacturing of high-value goods. That was always their plan. When I was in Beijing in the 80s, every single country in Africa was represented by a super smart, super sharp, African who had come from whatever country, and they were getting a full ride scholarship to Peking University, 4-year with all the trimmings. And this is when China was quite poor. And China plays a long game. Like China, when we see that, I just saw a bunch of African foreign students. What China saw was the beginnings of BRI and BRICS and it's now business dominance in Africa. And that's the reality, is that when we look at any issue of China, we always tend to look in our short-term lens without the benefit of really doing our deep research and reading their 5-year plans and understanding what they're doing. And when you look at those things, it makes much more sense. China does not have overcapacity when you look at the global demand it's creating for solar. Ethiopia just came out and said they're not going to allow any imports of internal combustion engine cars anymore. Any car that's imported into Ethiopia now has to be an EV. Why? Because they were watching their foreign reserves spent on oil and they've gotten tired of it. Whereas they can get a loan from China to install solar and then run a national fleet of cars on electricity. That makes a lot more sense for them. So all of a sudden, this overcapacity could look like an undercapacity. And by the way, right now, according to the latest data, is that even EV shipments have risen even since Yellen went over and said that China had an overcapacity in EV. So, these kinds of questions don't make sense unless you really understand the context. And the context is that China has a plan for how they're going to, work with all the countries of the BRICS and Global South in a way that's very different from the way the EU and the US has worked with these countries. And that's the reality. It depends. It just depends on whether you believe that China can execute on their plans. But I will say this: they've been exporting their infrastructure capacity for the last 7-8 years, and in every country where they go, do you really believe that it's really just about infrastructure? No, they're creating bridges, roads, ports, hospitals, stadiums. Why? What does a middle-class economy have? It has infrastructure. What are they providing? They're providing the basis for a future middle-class consumer economy in each of these countries. And so as they're doing this, they become the beneficiary and the creator in a symbiotic loop, a virtuous cycle, which is what we should be doing. That's exactly what we should be doing. Right.
See, the way you characterize it does not come across as some evil plot to saddle developing countries with debt. And as we can already see that some of the governance-related issues that China has had with BRI, it's not been a winning strategy for it at all. It's been actually a misstep. Whereas the way you are portraying it, which is, yes, I will lend you money and that will help my businesses to thrive in the new infrastructure that you have, because that infrastructure will require, again, electric grids and EVs, which my companies produce. That's a win-win situation. And I have absolutely no cynicism associated with that approach. I find it pragmatic.
Look, Neil Ferguson, who I have a lot of respect for, he wrote an article last month basically arguing that the only way to look at China and Russia and Iran is sort of Lord of the Rings, an epic fantasy battle between the forces of good and the forces of evil. And if one takes that approach, there's not a thing that I've said in this podcast which is going to resonate with them. I spent 30 years in China, so I have my own views. Do I think the Chinese are Boy Scouts? No, but they're definitely not anything like that I hear. Like, it just, there's not one thing. I've been everywhere in China, and believe me, it wasn't easy building a hotel chain in China. Like, I mean, you wouldn't believe the kinds of regulatory challenges we had and the kinds of like legal battles we had with franchisees that wouldn't take down our signs when they wouldn't pay. And we couldn't even sometimes get what's now Trip, then C-Trip, to take down the listings of terminated Super 8s from their website. So they were still being listed, even though we had an agreement with them. We couldn't even execute an internal agreement. I am well familiar with China, okay? And I do not hold any illusions. And yet I'm quite certain that there's no good or evil talking about. There's selfishness, selflessness, there's a collectivist mindset or an individualist mindset. You can talk about all the differences, but this idea that they're evil or that they have evil intent, it's just not borne out by the data. And I'm a data hound. I like what I can measure. I like what I can execute. I'm a businessman, so I'm not going to be falling into these flights of fancies of epic fantasy trilogies as a way to describe 21st century geopolitics. It's gonna be a fraught approach. If we're trying to avoid conflict, that's the wrong way to do it. I'm certainly no political expert, as you mentioned. I'm certainly not, and I like to stay in my lane. But I just don't see how a zero-sum mindset takes us anywhere we want to go. That's the reality. And I'm worried about my team. They're going to be fine. I'm worried about my team on this. And I'd like to see us get our game up.
I think that takes us perfectly to the final questions of this podcast, Mitch. You just talked about the zero-sum approach, but I know that in your writings you describe yourself as someone striving to create a positive sum outcome. Why don't you round up your view on this issue for us?
So zero-sum is what got us here, right? Zero-sum is tribalism, scarcity mindset, right? My tribe has to win, your tribe must lose. There's one fruit tree, and we want all that fruit, and we don't want to share it with that. That's sapien versus erectus. That's zero sum. But we now live in a world of exponential technology. So even if one feels comforted by the simplicity of a zero sum mindset, it absolutely will cause failure in a world which is now dominated by exponential technology, right? And the world we live in now doesn't allow us to have the simplicity and the supposed comfort of seeing things in a black and white term. So what I'm arguing is positive sum is leverage your adversaries as much as you leverage your friends. Create new industries that benefit the world, that benefits the U.S. too. Start to understand that there are other issues besides whether this tribe or that tribe wins. That is like whether the earth survives in this process. And EV and green tech, these things are the best news that we have, and we need to be creating these positive sum outcomes, even if the rest of the relationship is prosecuted in a zero-sum mindset in Washington and Beijing, which I'm sure it will continue to be. But at the very least, business can be aligning to the world it lives in now. We live in a world of AI. We live in a world of synthetic biology. We live in a world where, China, basically, when you show up in China, you are living in 2024. I mean, the way people dress and the cars they drive and the way you call for a ride and the way you pay and the way you order in a restaurant, all of this feels to me like I'm living in the 21st century. And that's because regardless of their government or anything else, they're very much aligned to a positive sum mindset, at least with regards to the developing world and the global South, very much in that mindset. They're not Boy Scouts, and they're absolutely mercenary and mercantile about how they do it, and they make no bones about it. They don't pretend. They're not really kind of trying to get their ideology out into the rest of the world. They're basically saying, you want a bridge? We'll build you a bridge. We know how to build a bridge, and you need a bridge, and we're going to give you a bridge. And are we going to benefit from that? Absolutely. I'm sorry. Did you think that we're doing this out of altruism? No, we're business people. As you've known for centuries and for millennia, we are business people. That's the difference. That's the mindset I got it. We talk about wanting to win in the West. But if you're going to win, you need to know which game you're playing, right? We think we're playing chess, which is a linear game where different pieces have different values, and it's all very, no matter how effective, even the grandmasters, they're still dealing with a relatively small board, and it's you win or I win, and I'm trying to dominate you, and I'm trying to basically clobber you. Whereas I believe the game we're actually playing, not just because China's playing this game, but because it's a game which aligns more to the technological times in which we live, is Weiqi or Go, right? Where each stone has equal value, and each stone if it's placed by a 9 dan master, it could change the game. Just one little stone in this enormous, 18 by 18 grid, it can change the entire game. Just that one little stone. And that's the game we're actually playing. And we got to get our game up. And we're going to have to learn to play that game, because we're not even playing the right game right now. And that's what positive sum is. Positive sum is actually just a more elevated way to be effective and to be more competitive and to be more, in a position to be able to win.
Well, may your positive sum narrative get lots and lots of resonance. Mitch Presnick, thank you so much for your time and insights.
Thanks for having me. It's been a real pleasure, Timer.
It was great to have you, Mitch. Thanks to our listeners and viewers as well. Kopi Time was produced by Ken Delbridge at Sply Studios. Bharat Lee and Daisy Sharma provided additional assistance. It is for information only and does not represent any trade recommendations. All 125 episodes of this podcast are available on YouTube and on all major podcast platforms, including Apple and Spotify. As for our research publications, webinars, and live streams, you can find them all by Googling DBS Research Library. Have a great day.